There we go. And okay, I think we've solved all problems, righted all wrongs, done all the deeds, and so here we are. Good evening. It is Sunday at well, now 1 minute after 7 o'clock here in semi-sunny northern. I almost said semi-sunny Southern California, but of course I am in Northern California. Although technically Northern California is a bit of a misnomer because basically they call everything, 100 miles north of LA Northern California. We're actually right smack dab in the very middle of the state. So we should be the middle of California or something, but they call us Northern. Anyway, hello. Good to see you. If you think I'm lying, go look at a map of California. Look at where the San Francisco Bay Area is. We are not in the north. We are right smack dab in the middle of the West Coast. Anyway, lovely to see you all. A pleasure as always. And in a moment, I'm going to check in with everybody and say hello. I think everything else seems to be good, at least using the new streaming software. I don't seem to at least have to deal with messages that I would keep getting popped up on my screen before saying, not enough bits per second. So I'm hoping that means that the broadcast is good and the quality is good. If not, please do let me know. It might be if you have something to tell me about the broadcasts, by the way. Although if it's something emergency like, oh, by the way, Tad, I can see you're on fire, that you can put in the comments because, that is pertinent to the moment. If it's anything about the overall quality of the broadcast or, anything like that, it's probably better to write me a separate message on either Facebook or Twitter and let me know, just because sometimes I don't even get to check all the comments while the broadcast is going on, and sometimes can't even access them afterwards. So, but as far as I can tell, things are working better than they were working, and that's good. That's all I care about. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to be reading, of course, from Otherland. This is the happy side of the book. This is the unhappy side of the book with a much younger version of myself on it. But before we do that, I'm trying to think about what I need to talk about. I talked about a lot of this stuff last night already. I will just quickly bring you up to par. Apparently, some of my publishers are going to publish a long short story stroke short novella that I wrote, which is Otherland based, which features Orlando, which is called The Deathless Prince and the Peach Maiden. I don't have the details on that yet. It's something that I wrote a few years back and which has been lying fallow, waiting for an appropriate outlet. So I'm still not quite sure. I only know about it because somebody asked me about it last night. They'd obviously heard about it somewhere and asked me in the comments section. And I had to say, I'm not even sure what's going on with that, but apparently something is going on with it. And I did just get a query the other day from, I think, my UK publishers about it. So I will double check on that information and let you know. As I said, it's a long short story, kind of short novella sort of thing. And I'm not exactly sure what's going on with it. It is of interest to Otherland fans because that, along with I've written three Otherland short stories that all take place after the events in the original series. I wrote The Happiest Dead Boy in the World, which is in the Legends anthology, #2, edited by Robert Silverberg. And that's quite a long story. Then I wrote one called The Dead Boy Detective in Oz, which also features Orlando, which was in a book of Oz related short stories. And then I wrote The Deathless Prince and the Peach Maiden, which is another Orlando related short story, also takes place after the Otherland books. But those, especially the Happiest Dead Boy in the World and the Deathless Prince story, both have a lot of the seeds of what might one day turn into an Otherland stroke Orlando novel, or even, if I'm feeling obscenely ambitious, another series. So definitely worth reading when it's available to you if you're interested in that sort of thing. What else? What else was I talking about? I was talking about the fact that there's been a bit of there's been a little negativity, which I fully understand, about the fact that we've had to change the series covers for the new Ostenard series, because the publishers just did a cover reveal the other day of Into the Narrow Dark, and a lot of people that I saw in the comments that I saw were very unhappy that it's not Michael Whalen, which I think I mentioned before that would be happening. And of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not happy either. I would have loved to have had Michael do the pictures for the last two. Um, as I've also mentioned, that this happened before with the Shadow March books, where Michael did the first one, and then the publishers, because Michael gets the big bucks publishing wise, in terms of cover artists, and the publishing folks up at the top, not my personal publishers at DAW, but higher up the ladder, decided that that would not do for the next books, and so the rest of the covers were done by Todd Lockwood, who did a very good job, instead of Michael. And now we've also got that happening again, whereas Michael did the first two, The Witchwood Crown and Empire of Grass. The third one is done more they're changing the style to something more iconographic, and it's being done by the same team, I guess, that did the Brothers of the Wind cover. And as you know, if you've seen that cover, it's what I would call iconographic, meaning it's more about symbols, not literal attempts to create an actual picture of a scene or something like that. That's what iconographic means. It means using icons. So I'm fully aware of that. I'm sympathetic. I would have loved to have had Michael doing the other two paintings, because, as you all know, I love Michael's work, and I've been lucky enough to have his paintings on a lot of my books. But that's also the way economics and the corporate world works, and that's going on. So there's nothing I can do about it except to say, hey, I feel your pain. It's my pain too. Anyway, so that was something else I was talking about last night. What else? We're actually doing well here. We're all healthy. After a lot of rains and winds and things like that, the local weather has been quite nice all week. I probably shouldn't even tell you, because some of you outside of California may be suffering through some really wretched weather. And I don't want to make it sound like, ha ha, because it's not fun. It's not fun. So I will just say we've had a nice week here weather-wise. We've been able to get out and around a bit. Still doing the pandemic shuffle, of course, and we'll continue to do so probably as long as anybody. And anything else? I'm working on Into the Narrow Dark. I have specifically on the maps. I've been working on the maps this weekend. I'm not doing the maps. That's Isaac Stewart with help from Ron Hyde, who is a reader who, along with Ilva and Jeremy Ehrman and Angela Welch, have become very involved in helping keep the continuity of things and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Troubleshooting mostly the books for history and stuff, because although I have now reread the first books, these folks had, many of them had read the book several times and kind of knew this stuff better than I did because I'm a writer. And so when you finish something, you don't sit there and go back over it and over it, especially not when you had to read through it like 5 or 6 times before publication, word for word. So I've had help from those folks. And currently, Isaac has been doing the maps for the new Ostenard series and doing a fabulous job, I have to say. And so we are prepping the maps for Into the Narrow Dark. And at the same time, I'm working on Navigator's Children, which will finish the series. Yes, I swear it will finish the series. This is not going to be, oh, now it's 5 books. It's not one of those open-ended things. It's just that as I always do, I miscalculated how swollen the book would get by the time I got to the last volume. And it would have been about the length of To Green Angel Tower, which was more doable as a project, splitting, a gigantic paper, a gigantic hardcover, then split into 2 paperbacks. It's harder to do these days. They had to get special paper, all kinds of things. So that's what's going on in the world of Tad and I finally got the Christmas tree out of the house. I'd been dropping hints to the kids for like literally weeks. Hey, Christmas tree, time to take the Christmas tree down. Hey guys, it's middle of January, time to take the Christmas tree down, blah, blah, and of course nobody takes my hints. I have stumbled into the parent zone now where I am just this thing that spouts noises that everybody has learned to comfortably ignore. So I finally just took it, ornaments and all. I did unplug the lights first, but I took it, ornaments and all, and just dragged it out the side door onto the deck, whatever you want to call it, because it's a freaking fire hazard. It's 2 months old, 3 months old at this point, and it's just dry as a bone. So that's my news, is I finally got tired of seeing the Christmas tree getting more and more potentially flammable and dragged it out to the side. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. 2 very excited dogs. Sounds like somebody upstairs has decided to order dinner, as they often do on nights when I'm doing this. Okay, let's check in. What's funny now is that we only have 2 dogs, and one of them is Big Dog with a big deep voice, and the other is, of course, tiny little Walter, who weighs about 6 or 7 pounds and has got an incredibly shrill voice. So it's like the counterpoint between like a sousaphone and a piccolo or something. It's just really bizarre and funny to listen to them. Anyway, sorry, I'm talking fast. I am going to check in quickly and see who has said hello. And I see first off Medardo. Hello, Medardo. Good to see you. Barb Ann, a pleasure. I'm doing well. I'm healthy, or at least, as healthy as I'm likely to be. And thank you for asking. Timothy, hello. Good to see you. Carl, hello. Good to see you. Cliff, good evening. Did have a nice day today. No complaints. Got a lot of important stuff done. Sent off some maps with editorial corrections, etc., etc. And now I'm going to read. And then afterwards, who knows? Maybe, watch some TV. Excitement. Anyway, Kristen, hello. Good to see you. Jeremy, hello. Oh, you noticed. Yes, I know. I found there's a switch where I can actually change that kind of thing. And I won't do it right now in the middle of it, but you can flip flop. So I put it back to the original again. Even though the part of the book I'm reading tonight, it would probably be more appropriate to leave it in looking glass mode. But I just thought, I'll try it and see if it works. And it worked. So who else? Tim. Hello, Tim. Good to see you. And Tim also says hello to everybody else. Mahmoud. And sending wishes from a cold, wet, and dark early morning in Belgium. Well, thank you for sharing with us, and good to see you. You must be very early in Belgium. It must be like 4 o'clock in the morning or something. Kristen got a leaky pipe fixed. Yeah, this kind of stuff is important. You got to take care of this stuff. Claudia, hello. Good to see you. Um, and now the shower is lukewarm. I'm sorry, Kristen. That sounds miserable. Emily, hello. Good to see you. Ray, hello, Ray. Good to see you too. And Kristen, meanwhile, is fulminating against the corporate overlords who won't pay for Michael Whalen's cover. Tony, hello, Tony. Good to see you. All right, Justin. Hello, Justin. Nice to have you with us. Yeah. Oh, Mahmoud thought that that was his neighbor's dogs. No, that's our dogs. They make a power of noise for being only two. Although of course Johnny is large and large chested because he's part Mastiff. He's a small version of Mastiff. You know, he's only about 70 something pounds, but he's got the big Mastiff chest and the big Mastiff jaw, and he barks very loudly. Brad, hello, Brad. Oh, calling in from Chi-Town, that Toddland town, one of my favorite places. So thank you for joining us, Brad. Anyway, so with that, I am going to start reading. So we're on a new chapter. Last night or early in the morning or whatever you want to call it, depending on what part of the world you were in, I finished off the chapter with Rini, which went through a whole roller coaster of different things happening. Rini and her father had wound up in an emergency shelter because of their apartment complex being burned down. And while they were there, Rini had gotten a call from Jeremiah Daco, who we met when he drove them in a couple of chapters back. Susan Van Bleek's, what you'd call it, assistant, servant, secretary. And he told them Susan had been attacked, that people had broken into their house, broken up her lab, and attacked and beaten Susan, and that she was in the hospital. And Rini went to go see her, and it was very traumatizing. And Susan could not communicate by anything other than squeezing her hand, but managed to eventually give her a list of letters signifying a message and about what had happened and who she needed to get in touch with. And later on, Rini managed to figure out that it was one of Susan's old hacker friends from many years ago that she had told Rini to contact. And just after that happened, Rini got a call from Jeremiah Daco saying that Susan had died, which was the end of the chapter, and very sad. At least it was for me when I wrote it, because even though she was only in the story for a little bit, I do get attached to characters, and I liked her character. So anyway, now we are going to continue with City of Gold and Shadow, and specifically with Chapter 18, Red and White. Netfeed Personals, your dream come true. Visual, picture of advertiser, MJ, female version. MJ, you see me. I'm your dream come true, aren't I? Look at these lips. Don't you want me to bite you just a little? Come visit me. I don't want little people with small ambitions. I want big boys with big ideas. We'll have such a lot to talk about and do. Just find my node, and we'll play some games that you'll never forget. Gally could barely stand. Paul stooped and lifted him in his arms and carried him out of the oyster house. The boy was... It has been a few weeks probably since we read that part. That's Paul stumbled into what we on the outside had begin to realize is the Looking Glass world, out of Alice Through the Looking Glass. Although Paul still has no idea why he's moving from world to world, including worlds that are made up. And in Oyster House, two characters who we recognize as the large and small persons who have been following Paul ever since he escaped out into the system, in the Looking Glass world, passing as the Walrus and the Carpenter have gotten into the oyster house and killed all the children there, except for Galley, who was with Paul at the time. Galley could barely stand. Paul stooped and lifted him in his arms and carried him out of the oyster house. The boy was sobbing so convulsively it was difficult to hold him. "No, I can't leave them. Bay's in there." "You can't help. We have to get out. They'll be coming back. The ones who did that." Galley struggled, but weakly. Paul pushed out through the door and plunged into the forest without even looking to see if they were observed. Surprise and speed were their best hopes. The light was dying, and they could be well into the thick forest before anyone followed them. He staggered for a long time with the boy in his arms. When he could run no farther, he set the boy down as carefully as he could and then slumped to the ground, cushioned by a thick carpet of leaves. The sky had turned the dark gray of a wet rock. The branches overhead were only wiry silhouettes. "Where do we go?" When he got no response, he rolled over. Galley was curled like a woodlouse, knees tucked, head in hands. The boy was still crying, but most of the force was gone. Paul leaned over and shook him. "Galley, where do we go? We can't just stay here forever." "They're gone." It was a kind of astonishment, as though it were only now becoming clear to him. "Gone." "I know. There's nothing we can do. If we don't find our way out, the same will happen to us." In fact, Paul knew that he would face worse things if his two pursuers ever caught him. But how could he know that? And how could it be true in any case? The strangers had cored the oyster house children, torn out their insides. "We belong together." Galley spoke slowly, as though reciting a lesson he wasn't entirely sure of. "I don't remember a time when it was different. We crossed the Black Ocean together." Paul sat up. "What ocean? Where? When did this happen?" "I don't know." Galley shook his head. "I only remember traveling. That's the first thing I remember. And we were together." "All of you? That can't have been very long ago. Some of them were only a few years old." We found the little ones along the way. Well, they found us. We twice as many now as when I first remember. Twice as many." His voice trailed off, and he began to weep again, a thin, hitching noise. Paul could only put an arm around the boy's shoulders and draw him to his chest. Why did this child remember more of his short life than Paul did of his own? Why did everyone seem to know more of the world than he did? The boy calmed. Paul rocked him back against his chest, awkwardly, but he had no better idea. "You crossed the Black Ocean? Where is that?" "Far away." Galley's voice was muffled in his chest. The day had almost failed now, and Paul could see only different forms of shadow. I don't know. The big ones told me about it." "Big ones? They're gone now. Some stayed behind in places they liked, or they got stuck, but the rest of us moved on because we were looking for something. Sometimes the big ones just disappeared like." "What were you looking for?" "The White Ocean. That's what we called it, but I don't know where it is. One day the last one bigger than me was gone, and then it was my turn to lead. But I don't know where the White Ocean is. I don't know where it is at all, and now it doesn't matter." He said this with a terrible, weary finality, and grew quiet in Paul's arms. For a long time Paul sat and held him, listening to the night noises, trying to forget, or at least to avoid reviewing, what he had seen in the oyster house. Crickets ratcheted all around. The wind rustled the uppermost treetops. Everything was very calm, as if the universe had paused. Paul realized there was no movement against his breast. Gally was not breathing. Paul sprang up in a panic, rolling the boy onto the ground. What are you doing? Gally's voice was sluggish with sleep, but strong. I'm sorry. I thought. He gently laid his hand on the boy's chest. There was no movement. Equally gently, moving with an instinct or memory he could put no name to, he slid his hand up to the hollow beneath the narrow jaw. He could feel no pulse. He tested himself. His own heart was beating rapidly. Gally, where do you come from? The boy mumbled something. Paul leaned closer. What? You're the big one now? Gally murmured, surrendering again to sleep. Bishop Humphrey, he said this was the best way. Despite his miserable, dark-ringed eyes, the boy spoke firmly. It had been a bad night, full of bad dreams for both of them. Paul was so glad to see the daylight again that he found it hard even to argue, although he was not entirely sure he trusted the bishop's advice. He also said there was some kind of horrible something this way, something dangerous. Gally gave him a pained look, which clearly said that Paul was now the oldest and tallest and shouldn't burden his younger subordinates with such worries. Paul saw a certain justice in this. He fell silent and concentrated on following the boy through the thick forest tangle. Neither of them spoke, which made traveling a little easier. Paul was heavily distracted. The bright morning could not quite burn away his terrible memories, either of what had happened at the oyster house or of the night's dreaming. In the dream, he had been a sort of herder, forcing animals onto a great ship. He did not recognize them, although there was something of sheep about them and something of cattle. Bleating, eyes rolling, the creatures had tried to resist, turning in the doorway as though to struggle for freedom, but Paul and the other silent workers had forced them up over the threshold and into the darkness. When all the animals were loaded, he had pushed the great door into place and locked it. Then, as he stepped away, he had seen that the place of imprisonment was not so much a ship as a kind of huge bowl or cup. No, a cauldron. That was the word, a thing for boiling and rendering. He could hear increasing noises of fear from within, and when he finally awakened, he was still full of shame over this betrayal. The dream memories lingered. As he tracked along behind Gally, the huge cup-shaped thing shimmered in his mind's eye. He felt he had seen it before, in another world, another life. A head full of shadows, and all the sunlight in the world won't drive them away. He rubbed at his temples as if to squeeze out the bad thoughts, and almost walked into a swinging branch. Gally found a stream which ran past them all the way down to the great river beside the oyster house, and they followed its course upward through sloping lands where the grass grew thick in the clearings, and the birds made shrill noises of warning at their approach, fluttering from branch to branch ahead of them until the invaders were safely distant from hidden nests. Some of the trees were laden with blossoms, powdery flares of white and pink and yellow, and for the first time Paul wondered what season it was. Gally did not understand the question. It's not a place, it's a time, Paul said. When there are flowers, it should be spring. The boy shook his head. He looked pale and incomplete, as though a part of him had been destroyed with his tribe of fellow children. But there are flowers here, Governor. None near the bishop's. Stands to reason all places couldn't be the same, then everything would happen all in the same spot. Confusion, you see. Everyone be running into each other. A terrible mess. Do you know what year it is, then? Gally looked at him again, this time with something almost like alarm. Yeah? Never mind. Paul closed his eyes for a moment to simplify matters. His mind seemed full of complicated strings, all knotted together, the whole an insoluble tangle. Why should Gally, not knowing something like what year or season it was, things which he himself hadn't even thought of until just this moment, make him so uneasy. I am Paul, he told himself. I was a soldier. I ran away from a war. Two people, two things are following me, and I know they must not find me. I had a dream about a big cup. I know something about a bird and about a giant, and I know other things that I can't always put names to. And now I am in the 8 squared, whatever the hell that is, looking for a way out. It was not a satisfying inventory, but it gave him something to cling to. He was real. He had a name, and he even had a destination, at least for the moment. Hard climbing now, said Gally. We're near the edge of the square. The slope had indeed changed and now mounted upward steeply. The forest began to thin, replaced by low, scrubby bushes and moss-covered slabs of rock, bejeweled here and there with clusters of wildflowers. Paul was growing tired and was impressed by his companion's vigor. Gally had not slowed at all, even as Paul was forced to bend almost double against the rising angle of the ground. The whole world suddenly seemed to shimmer and blur. Paul struggled to find his balance, but in that moment there was neither up nor down. His own body seemed to grow insubstantial, to drift into component fragments. He shouted, or thought he did, but a moment later things were ordinary again, and Gally seemed not even to have noticed. Paul shivered, wondering if his own weary body could have betrayed his mind. When they reached the top of the hill, Paul turned to look back. The land behind them seemed nothing like the bishop's grid. Trees and hills ran seamlessly together. He could see the bend of the river sparkling blue-white in the sun, and the now sinister bulk of the oyster house huddling beside it. He could see the spire of Bishop Humphrey's castle through the woods, and farther away other towers jutting up through the blanket of trees. That's where we're going, Gally said. Paul turned. The boy was pointing to a spot some miles away where a thickly forested ridge of hills descended almost to another curving stretch of river. Why didn't we just take a boat? Paul watched the light bounce up from the surface, covering the wide river with a mesh of diamond-shaped glints, so that it almost seemed made from something other than water, like moving glass or frozen fire. Wouldn't that be faster? Gally laughed, then looked at him uneasily. You can't cross squares on the river. You know that, don't you? The river's not like that. But we went on it. Just from the inn to the oyster house, that's inside a square. Permitted, like. Besides, there's other reasons to stay off it. That's why we went at night. The boy looked at him with a worried expression. If you go on the river, they can find you. They? You mean those two? Gally shook his head. Not just them. Anyone that's looking for you. The big ones taught me that. You can't hide on the river. He could not explain any more clearly, and at last Paul let the subject drop. They crossed the hilltop and began to descend. Paul could not immediately tell that they had entered into another square, as Gally called it. The land seemed much the same, gorse and bracken in the heights, thickening to forested hillsides as they moved downward. The only immediate difference was that there seemed to be more animal life on this side of the hill. Paul heard rustling in the bushes and saw an occasional bright eye peering out from the foliage. Once a drift of tiny piglets, the color of spring grass, came trotting out into the open, but they quickly fled away, squawking in alarm when they saw Paul and Gally. Gally did not know anything about them, or the other creatures. I've never been here before, have I? But you said you came from somewhere else. We didn't come in this way, Governor. All I know about is what everyone knows about. Like that. He pointed. Paul squinted, but could see nothing more unusual than the endlessly meshed branches of the forest. Nah, the boy told him. You have to get down here, lower. Kneeling, Paul could see a single mountain peak between the trunks, so far away that it seemed painted with a thinner paint than the rest of the landscape. "What is it?" "It's a mountain, you idiot!" Gally laughed for the first time all day. "But down at the bottom of it, they say, is where the Red King is sleeping. And if someone ever wakes him up, then the whole 8 squared will just go away." He snapped his fingers. "Poof! Like that. That's the story they tell, anyway. I don't see how anyone would ever know that unless they actually woke him, and that would fairly spoil the point." Paul stared. Except for its slenderness and height, it seemed a rather average mountain. "What about the White King? What if someone wakes him up? Same thing?" Gally shrugged. "Suppose so. But no one knows where he's sleeping except her white ladyship, and she ain't telling." By the time the sun had tilted past the topmost point of the sky, they had reached the bottomlands once more, a rolling sea of meadows and low hills interspersed with wide swathes of forest. Paul was again feeling tired and realized that he had eaten nothing for more than a day. He felt the absence of food, but nothing like as strongly as he felt he should, and he was just about to ask Gally when the boy suddenly grabbed his arm. "Look! On the hill, behind us!" Paul found that he was crouching almost before he understood what the boy had said. Some reflex against danger from above, some old story his body still told, had driven him down. He peered along the length of Gally's pointing finger. A shape had appeared on the hilltop. It was joined a few moments later by another, and Paul felt his heart go stone cold in his chest. But then a half-dozen more shapes appeared beside the first two, one of them apparently on horseback. "It's the Redbreasts," Gally said. "I didn't know they'd taken this square too. Do you think they're looking for you?" Paul shook his head. "I don't know." He was not as frightened of these pursuers as he was of the two who had called at the oyster house, but he did not trust anyone's soldiers. "How far is it to the edge of the square?" "A ways. We'll be there before sundown." "Then let's hurry." It was hard going. The thick undergrowth tore at their clothes with branches like claws. Paul no longer thought of food, although he still felt weak. Gally took a snaking course, trying to keep them out of the densest forest for greater speed, but also away from the places where they would be most visible. Paul knew the boy was doing a better job than he could, but they still seemed to be traveling at an agonizingly slow pace. They had just leaped from the security of a copse and were pounding across an open slope when they heard a clatter from the undergrowth. A moment later, a horse burst out and drummed across the open space in front of them, then turned, rearing. Paul dragged Gally back from beneath flailing hooves. The rider wore armor of a deep blood red. A helmet of the same color, in the perfect likeness of a snarling lion's head, hid his features. He stamped his long lance upon the ground. "You cross territory that has been claimed for Her Scarlet Majesty," he said, his self-important tones made louder and more hollow by his helmet. "You will surrender yourself to me." Gally struggled beneath Paul's hand. He was small and dirty, and it was difficult to keep a grip on him. "We're free folk. What gives you the say-so to stop us going where we please?" "There is no freedom but that of Her Majesty's vassals," the knight boomed. He tilted the lance so that its sharpened head wavered at the height of Paul's chest. "If you have committed no crimes and bind yourself to her in honorable fealty, then you will have nothing to fear." He spurred his horse forward a few paces until the bobbing lance almost touched them. "I'm a stranger." Paul was still struggling to catch his breath. "I am passing through. I care nothing about local troubles." "The urchin is an outsider, too," the knight said through the lion's snarling muzzle. "And he and his starvelings have caused nothing but problems since they arrived. Thieving, lying,
spreading nonsensical tales. Her Majesty will have no more of it."
"That's a lie." Gally was on the verge of tears. "Them are all lies."
"Kneel, or I will treat you as harshly as one of your capons. Spit, boy."
Paul pulled Gally back. The knight spurred forward. There was nowhere for them to go. Even if they could reach the trees behind them, it would only be a matter of time before he rode them down. Deadened, Paul slowly dropped to one knee. "What? What? What then? Who goes there?" Another knight now cantered into the clearing from the side nearest the river, this one dressed all in shining white, his helmet shaped like a horse's head, with a single horn protruding from its brow, an animal whose name Paul felt he should remember but couldn't. A wide array of weapons, flasks, and other objects dangled from the knight's saddle, so that his horse clattered like a tinker's wagon every time it moved. "Avant!" he shouted. "Or is it a right?" The red knight could not keep a note of surprise from his voice.
"What are you doing here?"
The figure in white armor paused as though the question were difficult.
"Took a bit of a dodgy turn, I suppose. Unexpected. Suppose we'll have to have a battle now." "These are the Queen's prisoners," declared Lionhelm, "and I cannot waste my time with you. I will allow you to retreat, but if I see you again once I have finished with these," he waggled his lance at Paul and the boy, "I will have to kill you."
"Retreat? Oh, hardly possible. No, can't do it. She's not my queen, you see." The white knight paused as if trying to remember something important. He reached up and pulled off his helmet, exposing a damp halo of pale hair, and scratched vigorously at his scalp. Paul stared in astonishment. "Jack? Jack Woodling?" The knight turned to stare at him, obviously puzzled. "Jack? I'm no Jack. See here," he turned to the red knight, "there's prisoners for you. I've had 'em myself. No respect, no understanding of the niceties."
"It's not him,"
Gally said in a loud whisper. Paul shook his head. This was rapidly becoming farce. But I've met you before. The other night, in the woods. Don't you remember?" The man in white armor stared at Paul.
"In the woods? Fellow that looked like me?" He turned again to the red knight. "I believe this chap's met my brother. Fancy, he's been missing for some time. Always was a rover." He swiveled again. "Did he seem well?"
Lionhelm was neither interested nor amused.
"Turn and depart, you lackwit wight, or it will go badly with you."
He drew his horse back a few restive paces, then couched his lance and pointed it at the newcomer.
"No, that won't do."
The white knight was growing perturbed.
"Have to claim this square, do you see? A serene and alabaster highnesses now, sort of thing."
He pulled his helmet on again.
"So I suppose it's a battle." "Idiot!" screamed the red knight. "You prisoners, you will stay there until I have finished."
The white knight had now lowered his lance and was cantering forward, banging and clanking as he went.
"Prepare yourself," he shouted, then undercut the effect by asking, "Quite sure you're ready?" "Run!"
Gally sprinted past the red knight, who turned his head to bellow at the boy, only to receive his enemy's lance in the middle of his breastplate. He flailed as he lost his balance, tumbled off his horse, and fell heavily to the ground. As Paul dashed past, the lion knight was already clambering to his feet, pulling a huge and unpleasant-looking mace from a strap on his saddle.
"Ah, a good one! Oh, very good, you must admit," said the white knight.
He did not seem to be preparing any defense as the red knight approached.
"But you'll kill him!"
Paul hesitated, then took a tentative step back into the clearing as the red knight swung his cudgel and smashed his opponent out of his saddle and onto the damp earth. Gally grabbed his sleeve and yanked him hard, almost pulling him off his feet.
"Leave them to go at it. Come on, governor."
He darted down the hill again, this time retaining his grip on Paul's sleeve. Paul had no choice but to follow, stumblingly after him. Within moments, the clearing was hidden in the trees behind them, but they could hear grunting, cursing, and a ponderous clang of metal on metal for some time.
"He rescued us," Paul gasped when they had stopped for a moment. "We can't just leave him to die." "The knight? Who gives the toss?"
Galley tossed his damp hair out of his face.
"He's not one of us. If he snuffs it, he'll be back again. In the next match." "Back? Next match?"
But the boy was running again. Paul staggered after him. The shadows were long and angular. Afternoon was fading quickly, the sun just resting on the spine of the hills. Paul grabbed at the boy for support when they stopped and almost dragged them both to the ground.
"Can't,"
he panted.
"rest. Not for long."
Galley seemed tired also, but far less so than Paul.
"The river's just over the rise, but we still got to follow it a ways before we reach the border."
Paul set his hands on his knees, but could not unbend his waist and stand straight.
If those two are fighting, why were you running?" "Because there were others. You saw them on the hill, redbreasts, foot soldiers, but they can move steady and quick when they want to, and they don't need to stop and wheeze their guts out."
He slid to the ground.
"Catch your breath, and we got to move fast like."
"What did that mean before? About the knight dying?" Galley rubbed his face, leaving streaks of dirt like primitive face paint.
"Them all, they just go round and round. They fight and fight until one side wins, then it all starts over again. This is the third match since we came here that I remember."
"But don't people get killed?"
"Course they do, but only till the end of the match, as they call it. Then everything starts up again. They don't even remember."
"But you do, because you're not from here?"
"Suppose."
The boy frowned, then grew thoughtful.
"Do you think maybe all the little uns, Bay and the rest, will be back next time? Do you think?"
"Has it ever happened before? Have you lost any of your little uns that way and had them come back?" Galley shook his head. "I don't know," Paul said at last, but he thought he did know. He doubted that whatever magic protected the natives of the 8 Squared extended to outsiders. When he could stand upright again, Galley led them on. After a short trek through thick forest, they pushed through a spinney of twisted trees and found themselves looking down a long grassy slope to the river. Paul had no chance to savor the view. Galley led him down to within a few hundred yards of the water's edge, then turned them toward the ridge of hills. They walked as quickly as they could across the sparse sandy meadows, the sun's orange glare in their eyes until they passed into the shadow of the hills. Paul stared out at the river and the dim break front of trees that ran along its farther bank. Just beside them, the shadowed water seemed full of blue gleaming depths. Behind them, outside the shadows, it seemed to smolder in the sunset light, like a long ribbon of molten gold. Somehow the river seemed at once both more and less real than the landscape it transected, as if a feature from one famous painting had been inserted into another. He slowed for a moment, suddenly aware of a cloud of partial memories that had gradually been making themselves more and more a part of his thoughts. Famous painting. What would that be? Where had he seen or heard of such a thing? He knew what it meant without quite being able to visualize anything that would correspond to the idea.
"Hurry yourself, governor. We won't be in the caves by dark or they'll find us."
"Why don't we just swim across the river to the other side?" Galley turned to glare at him.
"Are you balmy?"
"Or we can make a raft if it's too far. There's lots of wood."
"Why would we want to do that?"
Paul, as usual, had moved into conceptual territory where the bits of knowledge floating up did not seem to match the world around him. To escape, to get out of the 8 Squared. Galley stopped and planted his hands on his hips, scowling.
"First off, I told you you don't want to go on the river because you can be found. Second thing is, there ain't no other side.
What do you mean?
Just what I said. There ain't no other side. Even in Egypt knows that. You don't get out of the 8 squared that way. The river just goes past it.
Paul could not understand the distinction.
But, but what's that?
He pointed at the distant bank.
It's, I don't know, a mirror, sort of. A picture, maybe. But there's nothing there. That's how we lost one of the big ones. She thought she could cross, even though she'd been told. I don't understand. How can there be nothing out there when I can see something?
Galley turned and resumed walking.
You don't have to believe me, Governor. Get yourself killed if you want, but you and me, we won't pop up again the next match, I'm thinking.
Paul stood staring at the trees for some time, then hurried after him. When the boy saw he was following, he gave Paul a look of mixed relief and disgust. But then his eyes opened wide, staring at something even farther back. Paul turned. An object was speeding across the meadow toward them, still a long distance back, and moving too fast to be clearly seen. A trail of thin smoke hung in the air where the grass smoldered in its wake.
Run!
Shouted Galley. Despite his weariness, Paul did not need encouraging. They pelted toward the looming purple hills, whose skirts were now only 1,000 paces away. A nearer jut of stone, which Paul had at first taken to be another rock formation, revealed itself to be the work of human hands as they sped across it. The single triangular spike, taller than a man, stood at the center of a broad circle of flat stone tiles, incised with strange patterns. Running across the smooth, hard face of what Paul guessed was an enormous sundial actually sped their pace, and for a moment Paul thought they might reach the cave safely. Small animals with contorted, curving muzzles scuttled out of their path and into the surrounding scrub. They were just stumbling across the sand and rocky scree that marked the hem of the hills when a red something rushed past them with the noise and force of a small freight train.
Freight train?
Wondered Paul, even in his disordered panic.
What?
The thing pulled in front of them and skidded to a halt, throwing up a trailing barrage of hot gravel. Tiny stones pinged against Paul's chest and face. She was at least a head taller than he was, and bright red from head to foot. Every bit of her was the same glossy shade, even her haughty face and her upswept hair. Her vast, flared gown seemed made of something heavier and stiffer than cloth. A few wisps of smoke still drifted from beneath the hem.
You? I am told you refused my offer of vassalage?
Her voice was pump engine loud, but chilly enough to freeze birds on the wing.
That is not the way to gain my favor.
Galley was slumped beside him. Paul sucked in just enough breath to talk without squeaking.
We meant no offense, Your Highness. We only sought
silence. You will speak when spoken to, but only when I tell you that you have been spoken to. Now you have been spoken to. You may speak.
We meant no offense, Your Highness.
You said that already. I am not sure I wish to have you as vassals. In any case, you're frightfully stupid creatures.
She lifted her hand in the air and snapped her fingers, a noise as loud as a gunshot. From the trees far away along the ridge, 3 armored foot soldiers appeared and began skidding and tumbling down the hillside, hurrying to their lady's summons.
I suppose we shall simply have your heads off. Not the most original punishment, but I find that the old ways are the best, don't you?
She paused and glared at Paul.
Well, have you nothing to say?
Let us go. We are leaving. We have no wish to interfere.
Did I say you had been spoken to? Did I?
She frowned, honestly pondering.
Ah, well, if I remember and it turns out you have spoken out of turn, I shall simply cut your head off twice.
The soldiers had reached the flat ground and were hurrying toward them. Paul considered trying to dodge past the queen and sprint for the beckoning darkness of a large cave in the rocks only 100 paces away.
I see you, said the queen. I know what you are thinking.
There was not an iota of levity or human feeling in her voice. It was like being trapped by some horrible machine.
You may not plot escape without permission either. Not that it would do you any good.
She nodded. An instant later, she was 10 paces to one side. Paul had seen only a brief scarlet blur.
You are much too slow to outrun me, she pointed out, although you have moved a little more swiftly than I would have guessed. It is most infuriating when pieces come into the 8 squared and move just as they choose. If I knew who was responsible, heads would roll, I promise you.
She momentarily blurred again, ending up less than a yard from Paul and the boy, staring down at them with evident distaste.
Heads will roll in any case. It is only a question of which and how many.
The first of the soldiers trotted up, closely followed by his 2 companions. Before Paul could shake off his surprise at the queen's astonishing speed of movement, strong and ungentle hands pulled his arms behind his back.
It seems there was something else,
the queen said abruptly. She raised one scarlet finger to her chin and tilted her head to the side, woodenly childlike.
Was I perhaps going to cut off some other parts of you instead of your heads?
Paul struggled uselessly. The 2 soldiers who held him were as painfully solid as the queen appeared to be. Galley was not even trying to fight free of the man-at-arms who held him. "We have done no harm," Paul cried. "We're strangers here."
Ah!
The queen smiled, pleased at her own cleverness. Even her teeth were the color of fresh blood.
You have reminded me. Strangers!
She lifted her fingers to her mouth and whistled, an ear-jabbing blast of sound that echoed from the hillstones.
I promised I would hand you over to someone. Then I will have the heads off whatever is left.
Paul felt a sudden chill that moved through him like a damp wind from the night ocean. He swiveled, knowing what he would see. 2 figures had appeared on the meadow behind them, both wearing hats and cloaks, their faces shadowed. They moved forward deliberately, with no apparent haste. As the smaller of them spread its arms in a horrible mock display of surprise and pleasure, something glinted in the shadow beneath its hat brim.
"There you are!"
The voice made Paul want to scream and bite at his own flesh.
"We had wondered how long it would be until we found you again."
Galley moaned. Paul threw himself forward, trying to break free, but the queen's soldiers had him gripped fast.
"We have such special things waiting for you, our dear old friend."
The pair were closer now, but still not quite distinguishable, as though they carried some deeper darkness wrapped around them in a cloud.
"Such special things."
Even as Paul's knees gave way and he sagged into the strong arms of his captors, he heard a strange sound. Either Galley's moaning had become almost as loud as the queen's whistle had been, or the rumbling grew stronger. Paul dragged his eyes from the terrible yet fascinating spectacle of his pursuers and looked toward the hills. He wondered if an avalanche were beginning. Surely only the friction of stone on stone could make such a vast, deep
grating noise. But there was no avalanche, only a huge winged thing that growled as it emerged from the cavern in the hillside. Paul stared. The queen's mouth hung open.
"Jabberwock!"
choked one of the soldiers, a hopeless, terrified sound. Once out of the confining cave, the thing stood and spread its wings until the tips rose high enough to catch the sun's last rays in their veined membrane. The heavy-lidded eyes blinked. The head snaked forward on the end of an impossibly long neck, then the wings bellied and cracked as the creature took flight. Galley's captor toppled over onto his back, where he lay making a thin screeching noise. The beast went straight up until it hung in the bright sky above the hilltops, a black silhouette like a bat stretched across a lantern, then dropped into a dive. The soldiers holding Paul both let loose at the same moment and turned to run. The queen raised her arms and bellowed at the thing as it descended. Paul was staggered and then toppled by the gale as the creature spread its vast wings and banked upward, one of the terrible cloaked figures kicking in its bird-like grip. "Galley!" screamed Paul. There was dust everywhere, swirling funnels of it. Somewhere, through the grit and shadow and rush of wind, he could hear the outraged screams of the Red Queen. "Galley!" He found the boy huddled on the ground and snatched him up, then turned and began running toward the river. As they stumbled across the uneven terrain, the boy glanced up and saw their destination. "Now! Down!" Paul splashed into the shallows with a struggling child in his arms. As he waded out into the current, he heard a voice calling from the chaos behind him. "You are only making it worse. We will find you wherever you go, Paul Jonas." He let the boy go, then began swimming toward the far bank. Galley was floundering beside him, so Paul caught the boy's collar and kicked hard against the water and the tangling reeds. Something swooped past overhead, the wind of its passage beating the water into whitecaps. A scarlet figure that screeched like a boiling kettle dangled in its claws. The waves battered Paul and pushed him back toward the bank. He was growing weak, and the other side of the river was still very far away. "Swim, boy!" he gasped, letting Galley go. Together they struggled a little farther, but the current was sweeping them apart and also pushing them at a right angle to the bank, which seemed to grow no closer. A cramping pain shot through Paul's leg. He gasped and slid under, then thrashed in circles in the muddy water, trying to find his way upright again. Something was gleaming nearby, something distorted but bright like a candle seen through wavy glass. Paul struggled to the surface. Galley was paddling desperately beside him, chin barely held above the water, panic on his straining face. Paul stuck his head under the water again. It was there, something golden shimmering in the depths. He broke the surface, grabbed Galley, and pushed the boy's mouth shut. "Hold your breath," he gasped, then dragged them both under. The boy fought wildly. Paul kicked as hard as he could, trying to drive them both downward toward the distorted glow. Galley caught him with an elbow in the stomach, and air leaked from him. Paul coughed and felt the river rush into his nose and mouth. The yellow gleam seemed nearer now, but so was the blackness, and the blackness was closing in swiftly. Paul reached out toward the bright spot. He saw black water, swirling yet stone solid, and bubbles, golden lit, trapped as though in amber. He saw a frozen moment of Galley's face, eyes bulging, mouth wide in betrayed horror. Paul reached out. Then everything went away. And that's the end. Sorry, I ran a little bit beyond the usual finishing time. And that's it. Oh, and look at all the nice people who showed up after I started. Look at that. Mark's showed up, and Rose, and Steve, my old student Steve. Good to see you, buddy. I miss you. When the COVID pandemic is over, we are going to have that get together I was talking about. We'll get Pablo and Diana and David and Raul if he's around and whoever else is around. And we should all hang out. I'd love to see you guys. Kelly, hello. Good to see you too. Anyway, thank you all for hanging with me. I am going to hang it up for the night and, in fact, for the week. I will be back next week. First with the 1 a.m. in the morning slot, Sunday morning at 1 a.m., and then for the West Coasters and Americans in general, this particular 7 p.m. slot. Until that point, take good care of each other, take good care of your friends and neighbors, help the people who need help, especially during these rough pandemic times. If you got a little extra money, kick it loose to some charities that help, especially homeless people in the wintertime or whatever. That's it. Just do what you can. We'll all do what we can, and we'll get through this together. Thank you again for being with me. I will see you soon. Peace and good night.